Welcome to Drive Through History. We are driving around the part of downtown Athens, Greece. And if you ever want to see people driving without the laws of physics, this is the place to go.
My goal was simple, or so I thought. Find the Athens Acropolis. It's that plateau you always see in Athens pictures with all those ruins on top. I soon found out, however, as with the Roman Colosseum, it wasn't exactly a matter of nicely following the signs.
They need to fire the sign guy. Signage in this town is not great.
I was getting desperate, and desperate times call for desperate measures. So it was time to do the non-guy thing. Stop and ask for directions.
Yes, that way, straight. Do I make it? The first right? First right.
And no, faking the local accent didn't help much. And then, stopped for directions again. Even the local cops couldn't help me.
You will follow this
Okay. Acropolis, Parthenon? Yes.
He's heard of it. My third and final attempt was with a man who I soon discovered was about as lost as I was.
Just even a general direction would help.
I knew when he began asking for directions, I was in trouble.
Go around the circle? Yes.
But believe it or not, his directions
Round circle and left. Thank you, my friend.
were actually pretty good.
Acropolis.
And after a near deadly encounter with the local wildlife, I found it. The great Athens Acropolis.
Ideas like free thought, open questioning, and critical thinking were all fostered here in Greece like nowhere else in the ancient world. Men like Socrates and his student Plato and Plato's student Aristotle were by far the most influential. Their thinking replaced the older system of unquestioned loyalty to kings and court mystics and religious leaders. And they introduced the people to a new way of approaching life's questions and intellectual pursuits. And they swung the door wide open for a host of individual components that would influence Western civilization that followed. Things like popular rule, education for the masses, and the right to question long held traditions and authorities. One man, considered by millions to be one of the most colorful and influential in human history, a Jew named Paul, did that very thing right here in Athens, questioned the religious traditions of the day. And he did it right here at the Areopagus, Mars Hill.
In this episode of Drive Through History, we look at the life of the man who visited Mars Hill, a man who was, according to many historians, one of the most influential men to walk the face of the earth. Much of what we take for granted in Western civilization can be traced directly to what he taught and preached. His name was Saul of Tarsus, who later became known as the Apostle Paul. He was a prominent Jew, born in Asia Minor, and his citizenship was Roman. The ideas he spread would confront the ancient Greek culture and challenge conventional human wisdom, but they would also change human hearts, and in time, his message would alter the course of human history. But for many, the Apostle Paul is an historical mystery. Before he became the most influential spokesman for the gospel of Christ, he was Saul, a notorious and violent enemy of Christianity. He was an anti-Christian zealot, one whose single-minded ambition was to eliminate this new sect and destroy its followers. He traveled around Judea, hauling Christian believers into prison, even participating in their beatings and executions. But suddenly, without warning, Saul converted, becoming the chief promoter of faith in Christ. We'll revisit Saul later in Drive Through History, but since it's always important to know the context for any event in history, we need to set the stage for Paul's arrival in Athens. We need to understand the Greek culture and what made Athens such an important city during Paul's time. To do that, I wanted to take a closer look at the famous Acropolis. In the first century, it was covered in gleaming marble temples, and would have immediately attracted any Athens visitor like a magnet. In fact, one of Paul's most important speeches was given in the shadow of this immense Acropolis. There are countless Acropolises all over the ancient world. It's simply a word for the high place of the city. Acro means high, polis means city.
Can't believe I was driving around in that.
But not all Acropolises are created equal. The one in Athens is not only covered in awesome ruins, it represents a glorious age in the history of Greece, sometimes called the Classical Age. This period is also called the Age of Pericles, after the legendary and noble leader who was responsible for transforming Athens into what would become one of the world's great cities. Pericles not only fostered the power and popularity of democracy, which at that time was a radically new concept, but he also was behind the massive building projects on the Great Acropolis, including perhaps the world's most recognized structure, the Parthenon.
If you mention the city of Athens, this is probably what people think of. It's the Parthenon on the Acropolis overlooking the city of Athens, one of the most recognized landmarks in the entire world.
Long before the Parthenon, this Acropolis, the highest point in the city, was a military outpost, covered in fortresses, not temples. But by the 5th century BC, the military upheavals in the Mediterranean world had cooled down, and Athens was emerging as the embodiment of all that was good about the emerging and growing Greek culture. And it was King Pericles that led the city into that peaceful new world.
Pericles used the vast wealth of a defense fund to undertake an incredibly ambitious building project. To determine the face and the future of New Athens, Pericles converted the Acropolis, the high point of the city, into a stunning religious and cultural center that honored the most prominent personalities in the pantheon of the Greek gods. To this day, the complex he created on the Acropolis is the epitome of beauty and design in Western architecture.
It was as though Pericles and his architects borrowed a page from the most modern architectural textbooks of our day. They took the natural loftiness of the Acropolis and accentuated it with lines of sight and approach, so that it seemed to grow larger and more prominent as the work progressed. The first and most renowned structure of the Acropolis was the Parthenon, a building that has become the universal symbol of Greek art, architecture, science, philosophy, and literature. Designed by Pericles' hand-picked architects, the Parthenon itself deceived the eye and the mind into perceiving it to be even larger and more magnificent than it really was.
Unlike so many computer-designed buildings of our day, the Parthenon had no straight lines in its seemingly arrow-straight design, and the Doric-style columns around the perimeter were made intentionally imperfect. They bulge ever so slightly in the middle, taper toward the top, and lean slightly inward.
Bulge ever so slightly in the middle. But are these imperfections the result of bad design or worse workmanship? Hardly. The overall effect is that to the human eye approaching the temple at ground level, the columns actually appear perfectly straight and much taller than they really are. Even the fluting or vertical ridges on the columns become shallower near the top, adding to the effect that the columns are taller than they are. To keep the look of the temple perfect in spite of optical illusions that would convince the mind otherwise, the foundations of the temple actually curve or bow near the center as much as 10 centimeters in order to offset the illusion that they dip in the middle. Even the roof line, the steps, and the pillar bases curve slightly, and because the corner pillars would be viewed with open light behind them on all sides, they were made larger so that they would not appear smaller to the viewer. In other words, in order to appear perfect, the Parthenon was made intentionally imperfect. Perfectly.
It's probably safe to say that there is no more copied, imitated, and emulated architectural design than the Parthenon in Athens.
Whether or not we realize it, we probably drive past several, if not dozens, of Parthenon clones every week, from the pillars of the local library or city hall, to the monuments of American heritage in Washington, D.C., to the halls of learning at countless colleges and universities. The Parthenon has influenced Western architecture like no other building in history, and none of its imitators come anywhere close to surpassing it. So now that you understand a little of the sophistication of Athens architecture that loomed over the location of Paul's famous speech here, let's take a look at the sophistication of the people. Paul tailored his speech for a really smart crowd who loved new ideas and were always seeking after knowledge. Because, after all, it's important to know how much you know. You know?
Mention ancient Greece, and the word philosophy, which means lover of wisdom, isn't far behind. That's because some of the world's greatest and most influential thinkers and philosophers came from right here in Athens. I'm talking about the philosophical trifecta of Socrates, his student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. Now, I'm standing overlooking the ancient Agora near the Parthenon and Acropolis here in ancient Athens, where the philosophers used to come and share their ideas with the general public.
Ancient Greece was the birthplace of philosophy, and what we might call the modern way of thinking. During this history-shaping period, Greek philosophers played a huge part in the way that even the most common citizens looked at the world. The Greek philosophers radically changed their own world, and in doing so, helped shape ours. First, consider Socrates, who lived from 469 to 399 BC. Nearly everything we know about Socrates we know through the writings of his student Plato, because Socrates didn't believe in writing his stuff down. For him, knowledge was always changing and developing, so what was the point? Socrates claimed to know nothing except to know that he knew nothing. But he was nevertheless captivated by the quest for truth, a concept, ironically, that is almost gone in philosophical pursuits today. Socrates' method was to question other people on the positions they held until they arrived at a logical contradiction. This would prove that their original assertion was wrong and that truth was still out there somewhere. But Socrates himself, it must be noted, was rarely able to answer his own questions. But the quest for truth, he argued, must continue nonetheless, because, according to his famous saying,
"The unexamined life is not worth living."
Well, Socrates' radical ideas eventually made him some enemies in Athens, and in 399 BC, after being sentenced to death, he was forced to drink a chalice of hemlock. But he did leave behind that student I already mentioned, Plato. Plato not only published the ideas of Socrates, he did his predecessor one better by founding his own school, an institution called the Academy. Initially, Plato just carried on the method he had learned from Socrates, asked questions in order to pursue truth, which may, of course, change later. But as Plato matured, he began to do less questioning and more teaching. In other words, he drew conclusions and offered actual truths based on the process he learned from Socrates. In other words, he brought the educational method from simple critique to critical thinking. Plato left behind his own disciple of knowledge, a man named Aristotle, seen pictured with Plato in this version of Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens. Basically, Aristotle disagreed with Plato and Socrates at almost every level. He believed that many, many things in the world could be known for certain by observing and cataloging information. This is why Aristotle is considered the father of the scientific method. He introduced the idea of inductive reasoning and acquired knowledge, and he argued that evidence, not a consensus of opinions, carried the greatest weight in determining what is true. If it sounds like Aristotle would fit right into our modern society of scientific inquiry and empirical study, well, he would. From scientific experiments on the space shuttle, to environmental studies of endangered species, to historical analysis of the Middle East crisis, just about every self-professed expert in the world today can thank Aristotle for their jobs. By the way, Aristotle had a pupil of his own that went on to distinguish himself in a somewhat different area of life. That student was a conqueror named Alexander the Great.
Speaking of teachers and students, we live in a society today where learning is for everyone. And despite the fact that school can sometimes be kind of lame, we all agree that without it, we'd have a pretty sad culture. Now, you might be surprised to learn that education for the masses and learning for the general public was not our idea. It's very much a product of the ancient Greeks, who knew that if you could educate the general public, you could build a phenomenal society. No more education simply for the elites and leaving the masses in ignorance. That program only kept the rich in power and the general population poor and miserable. Not a good way to build a country.
By the time Paul arrived in Athens, it had become part of the Roman Empire, but it was still known for being the sophisticated and cosmopolitan city that had produced some of the world's greatest philosophers and political thinkers. It was also a very religious city. The streets were lined with temples and statues of gods and goddesses. Athens was advanced, sophisticated, intelligent, spiritual, and very much interested in new ideas. So now we understand the stage Paul walked onto when he came to Athens for the first time. But what about Paul? Why had he come here? And what prepared him for this encounter with the great minds of Athens? To answer that question, we need to go back in time to the events in Paul's life that led to this moment. So hold on for a high-speed tour through the life of one of history's most important figures. Okay, here we go. Ready? Saul was born in Tarsus, a city near the southeastern coast of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. He was a skilled tent maker, a trade he would continue throughout much of his life, but his passion was in his religious identity as a devout Jew. As a young man, he was sent to Jerusalem to study under the prestigious Gamaliel, who was a member of the Jewish law court called the Sanhedrin. It was under Gamaliel that Saul became a zealous Pharisee, which was a group who considered themselves to be the guardians of the Jewish law and traditions.
Paul's mission early in his career was to eliminate at all costs a growing and troublesome group of people called Christians, who believed that Jesus of Nazareth was Israel's true Messiah. Now for Paul, that was at best a misunderstanding, and at worst, a sinister perversion of the Jewish faith. In fact, the Bible reveals how Paul participated in the murder of prominent Christians and traveled around persecuting Christians for believing that Jesus was the Messiah.
But why was Saul so opposed to the followers of Christ? In the mind of Saul, if Jesus really were Israel's true Messiah, promised in the writings of the Old Testament, he would not have been killed at the hands of the brutal and vile Romans. The Messiah was supposed to be a great political deliverer, a powerful king who would emancipate the Jews and rule from an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem. Israel could then finally fulfill its calling as God's chosen nation. After Jesus was crucified, and according to as many as 500 eyewitnesses rose from the dead, his followers began claiming that his suffering, death, and resurrection were events that were supposed to happen to the Messiah. God had been faithful to his chosen nation, Israel, but in an unexpected way. Jesus' followers claimed that he did free them from bondage, but their freedom was not a political deliverance from the Romans. It was a spiritual deliverance from an even greater oppression, their slavery to sin. But for Paul, the most troubling thing was that the Christians were claiming that these promises of God were available to all people, not just Israel. The first time we meet Saul in the Bible is in Acts chapter 7. Stephen, an apostle of Jesus and eyewitness to his resurrection, was accused of blaspheming Moses and God. After being dragged before a council of Jewish leaders, Stephen defended belief in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah of Israel, which was blasphemy for the religious leaders. Saul was present in the council that day, and after Stephen was dragged outside the city walls, Acts records that Saul held the cloaks of the men who brutally stoned Stephen, giving his complete approval of the execution. Saul's mission was to continue this holy war against the Christian faith, the complete elimination of men like Stephen, whose message had to be snuffed out completely. That was the reason Saul left for Damascus in the year 34 AD. His goal was simple: hunt down believers in Christ, both men and women, and haul them back to Jerusalem to be either imprisoned or killed. But something happened on the road to Damascus that day, an event that left Saul trembling, blind, humbled, and forever changed. The account of Saul's conversion in Acts 9 describes a light from heaven that flashed all around him. Suddenly, a voice that literally knocked Saul backward onto the ground.
Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
It was the voice of the resurrected Jesus, who told him to continue to Damascus and wait for further instructions. The appearance of Christ left Saul temporarily blind, and after arriving in Damascus, it was a believing Jew named Ananias who restored his eyesight and explained that God had appointed him to see the righteous one, and respond in faith so that he, Saul, would become a witness to the world for faith in Jesus Christ. Saul's conversion, according to many defenders of Christianity, poses a real problem for the skeptics of Christian history. What would explain a man who so vehemently persecuted Christians suddenly, and with absolutely no logical incentive whatsoever, changing course and becoming a member of the group he and others had been persecuting? Some skeptics, in an effort to deny the miraculous nature of Saul's encounter with Christ, claim that it was a hallucination or a delusion brought about by the desert heat, or perhaps psychological self-doubt and intense internal conflict. But all the evidence, both from scripture and tradition, reveals a man who was not only of sound mind, but had a singular and relentless ambition, an objective no one could stop. But it did stop, on a dime. And suddenly, Saul's life and mission went full throttle in the opposite direction, supporting and spreading and eventually being executed for the message of Jesus as the Messiah. The radical nature of Saul's conversion gives every indication that it was indeed a true encounter with the resurrected Christ. It even resulted in a name change. He would become Paul the Apostle.
Paul spent some years sorting through this new experience, reconciling his Jewish upbringing with his newfound faith in Christ. But once all that was sorted out in Paul's mind, he became the chief spokesperson for Christianity, not just to the Jews in Israel, but also to the Gentiles. Because if Jesus was Israel's Messiah, then he was also the Lord over all the nations.
Paul then embarked on a 22-year apostolic career that would take him all over the Mediterranean world. One glance at the map section at the back of a Bible will show you just how active Paul's travel schedule was. His first of 3 missionary journeys included Barnabas, a trusted and loyal friend who had introduced Paul to the original apostles of Jesus in Jerusalem. Their initial journey together started in Paul's home base of Antioch. First, they traveled to Cyprus and converted the Roman proconsul stationed there. Then they traveled north into Asia Minor, where they arrived at another city named Antioch. From there, Acts 13 says, their message began to spread all around the whole region. After word got out, it wasn't long before Paul was the one being persecuted. The local Jewish leaders harassed him and banished him from the region. They then traveled on to Lystra, where Paul was stoned and left for dead. But after managing to escape, Paul and Barnabas left for Derbe, making converts along the way. Then, retracing their steps, they made their way all the way back to Antioch, encouraging all their converts they had made. Paul's second expedition included another friend of the apostles in Jerusalem named Silas. This time they went straight for Asia Minor, passing through Tarsus, then on to Derbe. In Lystra, Paul met a man named Timothy, who he persuaded to accompany them on their journey. It would be a friendship Paul would cherish for the rest of his life. They ventured northward, stopping often and continuing to spread the gospel and make disciples. Acts says the Holy Spirit then guided them to Troas, where they received a vision of a Macedonian man pleading with them for help. This call of God led them into Macedonia, to a city named Philippi, the city of an encounter with the demon-possessed slave girl who was probably a Pythia from Delphi that we looked at in the last episode of Drive Through History. There, Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown into prison, where after praying and singing hymns, a huge earthquake shook the jail doors open. The 2 missionaries prevented the jailer from killing himself and evangelized him with the gospel right on the spot. His entire family was converted, resulting in the release of Paul and Silas. Thessalonica and Berea were their next destinations. There, Paul encountered more Jewish leaders, some of which believed the gospel, others of which became hostile and opposed him by stirring up the people against him. He was soon separated from Silas and Timothy and was forced to leave. He chose to go south toward Athens to wait for the arrival of his companions. Paul's arrival in Athens is recorded in Acts chapter 17. Here, Paul soon discovered that Athens, a sophisticated, well-educated city, was full of idols, something which, Acts says, distressed Paul and provoked his spirit within him. The Bible also says he reasoned with local Jews and even some philosophers in the Athens marketplace. Paul's public discussions caused enough commotion to win him a hearing, before an elite group of Athens intellectuals called the Areopagus. One of the first places Paul preached in Athens was the local marketplace, but the modern Athens marketplace that I visited seemed an unlikely place for evangelism, what with people cutting up dead carcasses and all. But the more I've thought about it, what better place to find a captive audience? It's crowded, and people come here to exchange money and products. Why not ideas? And by the way, I reminded these guys to use a little disinfectant on the cutting boards before they cut the carrots and celery sticks for the party tray. And is that a bum I see on the cutting board? No, it couldn't be, could it? So now let's head over to the ancient marketplace, the one Paul would have visited. I wonder how many random thumb bones they have laying around this marketplace. Well, what's left of it is pretty much an outdoor museum. It's called the Ancient Agora, and it's where Paul first came when he visited Athens in Acts 17. From here, you can clearly see a huge marble hill called Mars Hill. This is the site where Paul encountered the elite council called the Areopagus, right in front of the great monument to the temples of ancient Athens, the Acropolis.
We're here again at the Acropolis in Athens, called by the Greeks the Sacred Rock, and it was the center for Greek pagan worship for centuries. Now, the big ticket item was, and still is, the Parthenon. It was built in the mid-5th century BC and dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the patron goddess of Athens.
But the worship of Athena is a relic of history, and the temples on the Acropolis that throngs of tourists flock to each year are nothing more than monuments to a belief system that has been dead for centuries. Ancient Greek paganism has done little, if anything, to influence the course of history throughout Western civilization. But the great thinkers, philosophers, and ideas that were discussed and explored on Mars Hill went on to change the world. One of those ideas was Paul's.
But what was the Areopagus? In pre-classical times, before the 5th century BC, it consisted of the council of the city's elders. And then in classical times, it became a homicide court. But by the time Greece was subsumed into the ever-expanding Roman Empire, the Areopagus functioned in a much less formal way. It became the council of the guardians of Athens' morals, religion, and tradition.
But Acts 17 also says that the Athenians enjoyed spending their time telling or hearing of new ideas. So when an educated, articulate foreigner wandered into town talking about a resurrected man who was the Son of God, it instantly qualified for something new and different. And it wasn't long before Paul was standing in the midst of an interested but skeptical Areopagus, having to defend his radical new idea.
Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious.
That was how Paul started off on Mars Hill, as he recounted seeing the countless objects of worship all over the city. He then mentioned an altar he had seen dedicated to an unknown god, which was a way the Athenians could appease the one god they perhaps missed by accident. Paul was appealing to that sense in all humanity that there is someone above us and beyond us that deserves to be worshipped. And even though the Athenians didn't realize it, what they were really searching for in their endless polytheistic attempts was the one God revealed in Jesus Christ, even though, as Paul said, he is actually not far from each one of us.
Perhaps one of the most significant points that Paul made on this huge slab of marble, the Areopagus, in the shadow of the Parthenon overlooking Athens, was this: that although the city was full of idols and the Athenians were extremely religious, the God they called unknown was really a God that doesn't dwell in temples made by human hands. It's because the Christian faith is really a message-based religion centered around a person.
Paul's point about God not dwelling in temples made by man was nothing less than a full frontal collision with the Greek worldview. It meant that the huge architectural monuments to the gods, seen just over his shoulder, were quite simply meaningless. The false gods of Greek religion, and even the human power structures of the Roman Empire, were not, and never would be, the ultimate authority. They were poor substitutes for the one true God. Paul finished his speech here at Mars Hill by telling how God had vindicated Jesus of Nazareth by raising him from the dead.
And while the Athenians did like to toss around new ideas, the bodily resurrection of Jesus was just a little bit too much for them to take. And the Bible says some began even to mock Paul. But much to the chagrin of the Areopagus, and perhaps to the surprise of Paul himself, converts were made that very day. One of which, named Dionysius, was himself a member of the Mars Hill Council. A ripple effect was beginning in Athens, and it started right here, on this insignificant slab of marble. Today, even though the tourist trade has largely ignored Mars Hill, and no one seems concerned to sweep up the cigarette butts and litter, Mars Hill is still a place people come to talk and discuss things. These days, it's not the cultural elites and philosophers, but the everyday people. On any given day, you will find dozens of local Greeks watching the sunset, talking and discussing things. So ideas are still being shared on Mars Hill, just like they were 2,000 years ago. From Athens, Paul continued on his missionary journey to Corinth, a city we'll explore in depth in the next drive-through history. Here, Paul wrote 2 letters to the Thessalonians, and probably the letter to the Galatians as well. Then, after a brief stop off in Ephesus, Paul sailed to Jerusalem and then back to Antioch, where he ended his second missionary journey. Paul soon set out on his third and final missionary expedition that took him again into the heart of Asia Minor to strengthen the churches he had planted on his earlier trips. His primary destination this time was Ephesus, the capital of Asia Minor. Here, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians to the church he had planted in Corinth. He also encountered some of the fiercest opposition he had ever seen, which resulted in a dramatic showdown with some Ephesian craftsmen who realized that Paul's message was hurting the local trade in pagan idols. The conflict in Ephesus soon reached a fever pitch that resulted in Paul's departure for Macedonia, where he wrote 2 Corinthians, and then on to Corinth, where he spent the winter and wrote the letter to the Romans. And finally, the following spring, Paul set out again to return to Jerusalem, every step of the way visiting, encouraging, and supporting the churches he helped establish. While in Jerusalem, some of the Jewish leaders falsely accused Paul of bringing Gentiles into the temple, an accusation which again landed him in prison. But Paul, who was still a Roman citizen, was shrewd enough to appeal directly to Caesar, avoiding a local trial in Jerusalem that would have certainly resulted in his death. While in captivity, Paul made his appeal before the governor Festus, King Agrippa, and his wife Bernice. The king had no choice but to send Paul to Rome.
I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains.
The journey to Rome in the year 59 AD is perhaps the most dramatic sequence of events in Paul's entire life. The grain freighter that carried Paul and the other prisoners was caught in a vicious northeastern storm called a Gregale, which thrashed the vessel with violent storms. The boat drifted for 2 weeks, lost on the Mediterranean Sea, until it finally crashed into a reef off the coast of an island called Malta. Paul and the rest of his fellow captives washed ashore. And Acts 27 records that not a single man was lost. After a few months, Paul finally reached Rome. He spent the next 2 years under house arrest, where he was able to preach the gospel without opposition. There he wrote the New Testament letters to Philemon, the Colossians, the Ephesians, and the Philippians. He was briefly released from Roman imprisonment and spent the next few years doing further missionary work and wrote his first letter to Timothy and a letter to Titus. He was eventually imprisoned in Rome once again, this time under the rule of Emperor Nero, who had already been busy persecuting Christians. Paul's final letter, 2 Timothy, was written as he awaited his own death under Nero. In the year 67 AD, Paul was beheaded. When it came to confronting the culture of his day, Paul didn't give an inch. He was compassionate, but he was also blunt. He was perfectly logical, but he never hid the fact that Christianity is based on faith or trust in certain facts of history. He spoke to elite intellectuals, everyday commoners,
and kings in positions of power, all without compromising his own commitment to Christ. And he confirmed his message with blood, bruises, beatings, and ultimately martyrdom. Perhaps what made Paul so effective and so influential in the course of history was his unflinching courage and constant awareness that, as he told his Philippian church, I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Yeah. Bulging in the middle. Kind of like me.
Oh boy, it stinks out here, man. That dog is so dead. There's a dead dog right there and it stinks.